The galaxy is littered with the wreckage of empires, but none leave a shadow so enduring as the warp. It is not simply a dimension of travel or a channel for psykers to draw upon, but a devouring sea that drinks memory, identity, and even the final breath of a soul. For the Imperium, the warp is a tool of survival. For the damned, it is a sentence with no end. Imagine a place where pain is not a wound, but a language, where time does not march forward, but folds in on itself, and where the cries of the lost do not fade, but grow louder with every century that passes. To glimpse such a place is to understand why even the most hardened commissar shudders at the thought of dying This is not death. This is not silence. This is eternity rewritten in the voice of horror. And it is here, inside the warp, that the damned find their final dwelling. The stories of those trapped there are more than whispered nightmares. They are warnings. Pilgrims mutter prayers before shrines not merely out of faith, but out of fear that their souls might join that chorus of the lost. Sanctioned psykers, their eyes hollowed by too many visions, describe scenes so twisted they must be dismissed as delusion, yet the consistency of their terror binds their words into truth. These fragments, these testimonies, are what we will follow. The warp is not only a battlefield of gods and demons, but a prison of souls, each screaming for a release that will never come. If this descent into the abyss grips you, if the unraveling of the warp's secrets draws you further, let your voice be counted among ours. Like, share, and subscribe, so that the tale does not fade into silence, and so the echoes of these stories may continue to reach across the void. Now we turn to the journey itself. The moment of death is never clean, even when the blade strikes true or the low's bolt burns through the chest. The passage from flesh to elsewhere is not as swift as mortals wish to believe. The soul, torn from the body, does not rise with dignity nor sink with peace. It stumbles, it falters, it slips between worlds as if falling into a chasm without light or bottom. The first breath of the damned is not a breath at all, but a realization that they have no lungs, no tongue, no anchor to the material that once defined them. The absence is total, yet the awareness persists, sharp and painful in its clarity. What remains is self without substance, a fragile ember adrift in a storm no one was meant to endure. The warp does not greet with fire or revelation. It greets with silence that feels wrong, silence that breathes, silence that bends around the soul like an unseen predator circling. In that void, the newly dead grope for bearings. They expect heaven, or nothingness, or the Emperor's light. Instead, they find their senses inverted. Sight without eyes, sound without ears, the taste of ash on what no longer is a tongue. Every impression is raw and overexposed, bleeding into them until they can no longer tell what is internal and what is inflicted from outside. Disorientation is the law here, the first chain that binds the damned. Some cling to memory as ballast. A guardsman recalls the crack of less fire, the weight of his flak armor, the shouted command of his sergeant in a trench now far behind him. A miner remembers the stink of promethium, the grit of stone in his teeth, the pressure of the shaft's air around his lungs. But memory in the warp is not solid. It bends, it melts. The sergeant's voice echoes too long, stretched thin until it becomes a whisper not his own. The grit of stone becomes the grind of teeth that are no longer in his mouth. The weight of armor tightens, crushing him with a burden his soul cannot shed. Memory is both shield and torment, a fragile mirror that cracks on contact with the immaterium. Time dissolves next. There is no rhythm to the warp, no heartbeat to pace thought. A moment could be a century. A century could collapse into an instant. The newly damned cannot tell if they have lingered for a breath or for an age. The absence of time unmoors them further. Without a sequence of before and after, they cannot measure suffering, cannot hope for its end. They drift in an eternal present, a single stretched moment of confusion that feeds upon itself until panic sets in, And when panic erupts, the warp answers. The first voices come then. They are not thunderous nor commanding. They are insinuating, a child's giggle, faint and distant, brushing the edge of perception. The murmur of a prayer in a dialect half remembered. A mother's lullaby twisted in tone until it carries menace. These voices do not speak with clarity, but they call with intimacy, reaching into the hollows of memory and tugging. The damned feel exposed, as if their thoughts are not private, as if even the act of clinging to self is something watched, tasted, and judged. The warp does not announce itself as an enemy. It makes itself known as something already inside. Some souls thrash against this intrusion. They scream, though they have no throats, and their cries ripple through the unseen dark like sparks in oil. Others fall silent, clinging desperately to prayers. By the throne, guide me. Emperor, protect. The words flicker in the void, brief flares of gold. But here, even prayer bends. The syllables distort, stretching into chants that echo back with meanings the faithful never intended. Some hear their prayers repeated in tones of mockery. Others hear them answered by voices that claim to be the very emperor they invoke, yet dripping with hunger. Faith, like memory, proves a weapon too fragile to endure untouched. And through all this, the damned begin to sense their shape, or, rather, their lack of it. They feel as though they are both vast and infinitesimal, stretched across horizons, and yet crushed into a point. Some perceive themselves as forms of light, others as shadows, others as nothing at all, but all feel the same fragility. The soul here is thin, a membrane ready to tear. The realization comes like frost sinking into marrow. Whatever they were in life is stripped away. They are not warriors or miners or mothers any longer. They are sparks, and the warp is a storm. The confusion grows heavier, sinking into despair as the first illusions emerge. Some souls see faces in the void, loved ones reaching out, comrades beckoning, saints smiling with open arms. Others see landscapes, fragments of homeworlds, familiar places painted with impossible clarity. These sights appear as lifelines, drawing the damned forward with a desperate yearning, but they are not lifelines. They are hooks. Each step toward them twists reality further, pulling the soul deeper into the warp's web. The more they try to walk, the more the ground beneath them collapses into writhing shadow. The faces melt, the landscapes rot. Hope becomes the first bait, and the first betrayal. And so the foundations of identity begin to crumble. What was once a soldier is now a scream without form. What was once a mother is now a memory stretched and hollowed into echo. What was once a man, a woman, a child, becomes something less certain, something raw, trembling at the mercy of forces it cannot name. The warp does not rush to devour them whole. It takes its time. It waits as the soul dismantles itself, piece by piece, until what remains is vulnerable enough to be claimed. The threshold has been crossed. There is no going back. The damned, in their first steps beyond flesh, come to understand that death was not an ending but a door, and the place beyond is not silence but a hunger waiting to know their name. The silence does not last. It never does. For the damned, the void that first swallowed them soon reveals its true appetite. They begin to feel it, not as a storm that batters from without, but as something pressed close, skinless and immediate, sliding along the edges of thought. At first it comes as a whisper, delicate, almost tender, as though the warp itself leans near to breathe upon their essence. The sound is not carried by air, it comes from within, resonating like a vibration inside the marrow of what they no longer possess. It is not a voice, not truly, but the shape of a voice formed from hunger. Every soul recognizes it, though none have heard it before. It is the sound of being noticed. The warp does not rush to strike. It lingers, studying, drawing out the moment, until desperation begins to erode what little strength the soul has left. Those whispers coil around the damned like unseen fingers, stroking them with false intimacy. The words are broken fragments, drawn from the victim's own memories. A mother hears her child's laughter, carried back to her, but soft and warped, thickened into something that lingers just too long. A soldier hears the sharp cry of a sergeant urging him onward, but the tone bends, becomes coaxing, becomes hungry. These are not lies manufactured whole. They are truths corrupted, echoes turned back with sharpened edges. To resist is to realize the warp is not outside but inside, plucking threads of self to weave its whispers. And when the soul resists too long, the touch becomes teeth. The hunger is not a devouring in a single instant, but a grazing, intimate and endless. Fragments of memory are bitten away first. A name begins to fade from the damned's grasp, gnawed into nothing until the sound of it feels alien upon their own tongue. The memory of a face once beloved grows indistinct, colors bleeding into gray before vanishing entirely. It is not the grand moments the warp takes first, but the smallest, the anchors of self too fragile to withstand the pressure. Each loss is felt as pain, but also as hollowness, a thinning of the soul until it feels perforated. The warp feeds not by destroying outright, but by taking in intervals, savoring, returning again and again until its prey is exhausted. The damned begin to realize that their suffering is not merely an accident of being trapped in this dimension. It is cultivated. They are not left to decay unattended. They are tasted, tested, and revisited as though by a host with endless patience. The warp does not forget its morsels. It marks them, learns them, remembers their weaknesses. Each time a whisper returns, it strikes more precisely. Mimicking the sound of a voice the victim most longs to hear or most dreads. It finds the seam in the soul and pries it open. The intimacy is unbearable. This is not the distance of an uncaring predator, it is the closeness of a parasite, a presence that knows you more intimately than you ever knew yourself. There is no sanctuary in silence. The souls learn quickly that trying to withdraw into themselves only sharpens the hunger's grip. When they attempt to shut away memories, those very thoughts are the first to be pulled forward, exposed, and consumed. The act of resistance becomes nourishment. The more they fight, the more flavor the warp extracts from them. Some try instead to surrender, to dissolve willingly in the hope that compliance will bring peace. But the warp is not so merciful. To give oneself freely is to be made bland, unappetizing. And so, the warp refuses total surrender, leaving them half consumed, half whole, trapped in the balance of torment, where they remain useful. The feeding is measured, never complete, stretched thin across centuries. There is no relief in death, for death has already been surpassed. There is only harvesting. The damned begin to feel the hunger even in what little sensation they retain. To some, it is a gnawing ache at the core of their essence, like marrow sucked from hollow bones. To others it manifests as cold fingers pressing against the remnants of a heart that no longer beats. And still to others, it is the slow drip of something corrosive upon their very being, burning them away molecule by molecule. Every soul translates the feeding through the language of its own suffering, yet the truth is the same. They are food, not feasts devoured in triumph, but fields left to be reaped and resown, endlessly bled for flavor. The warp has no need to waste. It prefers its meals lingering. And still the whispers speak. They croon comfort even as they wound. Rest, they say. You are safe now. The words are delivered with warmth that almost convinces, with tones taken from memory itself. Yet each phrase drags another cut into the soul. The intimacy deepens, until the damned can no longer tell if the thoughts in their mind are truly theirs, or the mouth of the hunger speaking through them. This is the most insidious cruelty, to erode the boundary between self and predator until the two are indistinguishable. The damned are not merely consumed, they are transformed into their own tormentors, repeating words fed into them until they can no longer remember silence. Some few souls scream endlessly, refusing to break, pouring defiance into the void. Their cries echo, shuddering across the Imperium like sparks of defiance. But here even defiance has taste. The warp savors that bitterness, drinks it deep, and returns for more. Others collapse into quiet, hollowed shells, who drift without resistance, feeding the hunger by their very emptiness. Both paths lead to the same end. Both are nourishment. There is no strategy that starves the warp, and through it all, the damned learn the most shattering truth. The warp is not blind. It does not feed at random, nor does it strike without purpose. It chooses, it selects, it studies its prey with intimacy that borders on love, though it is love sharpened into cruelty. It knows which memory to pluck, which fear to twist, which hope to poison. Its hunger is intelligent, its gaze relentless. The damned are never unseen, never ignored. They are objects of attention, of fascination, and that knowledge, more than any wound, breaks them not. Memories are the last possessions of the soul, the final fragments of what once tethered a human life to meaning. Yet in the warp, they are not safe keepsakes. They are torn open, bartered, and displayed as though each soul were a stage for a theater of cruelty. The damned soon discover that what they carried into death, their joys, their regrets, their fleeting moments of love, are no longer theirs. They belong to the warp now, and the warp delights in reshaping them. The first assaults are subtle. A soldier sees the battlefield where he fell, the crack of lasguns, the stink of blood in the trenches. For an instant, he believes himself returned, that perhaps death was a fever dream, and he still fights beside his comrades. But then the details shift. The banners above the trenches no longer bear the imperial aquila, but grotesque, leering symbols that pulse like open wounds. The comrades beside him do not wear helmets, they wear the skin of their own faces stretched taut across bone. The less fire still shrieks, but each bolt carries with it the echo of his own name. He realizes then he is not reliving the battle. He is being made to watch a parody, a grotesque reenactment designed to strip away not only the pride of his service, but the very meaning of his sacrifice. For others, the cruelty is more intimate. A mother remembers the day of her child's birth. She recalls the warmth of tiny fingers curling around her own, the first cry that was both agony and miracle. But in the warp, that cry does not end. It lengthens, a single note stretched into eternity, rising in pitch until it becomes a scream that never stops. The child rides in her arms, its form warping with each heartbeat, shifting into faces of strangers, then into demons with jaws too wide, then into nothing at all. Each time she clutches the infant close, it dissolves into smoke, leaving her hands empty. Then the cry begins again. Love becomes torture, and what was once the most sacred of memories becomes an endless wound reopened by unseen hands. This is the law of the warp. Memory is flesh, and flesh is meat. The soul is carved not by blades, but by recollection turned sour. Every precious moment becomes raw material for cruelty. The damned are forced to watch their lives replayed, but never as they lived them. Instead, they are shown what they fear they were, what they regret, what they cannot bear to lose. The warp does not invent from nothing. It extracts, distorts, and exaggerates until the soul is consumed by the horror of its own past. The damned learn that their torment is not foreign. It is authored from within. The most devastating wounds come not from twisted fear, but from twisted joy. A man who once knew peace and prayer finds himself reciting the litanies of the ecclesiarchy, but the words slither from his tongue in unfamiliar cadences. His hymns end not in the emperor's name, but in invocations of things he does not recognize, things that leer back at him from the void. The faith that once steadied him becomes the very chain that binds him, his devotion transformed into mockery. Every soul learns this lesson. The warp has no need to invent cruelty when it can take what you love most and turn it against you. Over time, memories stop belonging to the damned at all. They are stripped away, pulled from within, and played like hololithic projections in the dark. The warp does not torment one soul in isolation. It displays recollections for others to see. A child is forced to watch the execution of a stranger, over and over, until the horror becomes their own. A priest sees the betrayal of comrades he never had. The boundaries between individual lives blur, and the damned begin to lose track of which memories were theirs. This collapse is no accident. The warp thrives on confusion, on dissolving the borders of self. When a soul can no longer distinguish its own history, it becomes infinitely pliable, and there are worse fates still. Some memories are stolen outright, consumed until there is nothing left. A woman who once held tight to the image of her husband's face finds that face dimming, blurring, and finally vanishing altogether. She knows she loved him, but cannot remember his features, his voice, even his name. The warp has eaten it whole, leaving her with an emptiness she cannot fill. That hollow absence becomes agony sharper than any flame. To be stripped of memory is to be hollowed from the inside, until the soul feels like a shell waiting to collapse. The warp feasts slowly, savoring each fragment, but it also displays an artistry that terrifies. It stitches memories together into grotesque collages. A soldier might find himself back in his childhood home, only to realize the walls are built from the corpses of comrades he buried years later. A scholar recalls his first study of a sacred text, only to find the words reshaping into the screams of his family's execution. The warp does not simply replay, it remixes, weaving past and future into nightmares that erase all distinction between what was real and what is torment. The damned soon come to fear their own minds more than the void around them. Yet through it all, one truth grows impossible to ignore. The warp is not careless. It does not squander its prey. It studies, learns, and refines. Each new assault cuts closer to the core of self, carving away layers until nothing remains untouched. Memory is not random spectacle. It is scalpel and chisel, carving the soul into shapes of despair. Each scream, each hollow sob, is both sustenance and art for the unseen predators that dwell here. And when the carving is deep enough, when the soul is whittled to a trembling fragment, the warp leaves behind a final cruelty. It allows the damned to glimpse their life as it truly was, not distorted, not twisted, but clear and whole. For a brief instant, they remember with purity the laughter of friends, the warmth of family, the pride of service. And just as they clutch at it, desperate for that light, the memory is torn away forever, consumed so completely that it cannot be recalled again. It is the ultimate theft, not only to wound, but to deny even the hope of remembering what was lost. This is the fate of the damned in the warp. Their lives do not end with death. They become raw material for torment, their memories the canvas, their suffering the masterpiece. The soul learns it has no privacy, no sanctuary, no final refuge. It is flesh without bone, carved endlessly for the delight of powers it cannot comprehend. The cries of the damned do not vanish into silence. They echo, they overlap, they merge into something greater than the sum of their anguish. A soul may begin its torment, believing itself alone, its screams swallowed by the void. But the warp has no walls. Every cry bleeds outward, tangled with countless others, until the Imperium itself vibrates with despair. Soon the newly damned discover that their suffering is not private, nor is it singular. Their voices are drawn into a choir without end, a symphony composed of agony, where each soul is only one note in a song that never stops at first. The voices clash in chaos, millions shrieking, pleading, wailing in discord. But the warp does not allow chaos to remain formless. It shapes, it orders. The howls stretch into rhythms, the sobs fall into cadence. The shrieks bend into melodies too vast and terrible for human comprehension. What emerges is not noise, but arrangement, a harmony of despair carried across endless horizons. The damned feel their own voices shifting, compelled to match pitch, to blend, to surrender individuality for resonance. Their cries become instruments they cannot lay down, played not by choice but by the unseen hands of the warp itself. And there are conductors. Demons move through this choir like predators through herds, but also like musicians among their orchestra. They coax the notes, sharpen the tones, bend screams into arias. Some encourage with claws pressed into spectral throats. Others draw out melody with promises whispered into hollowed minds. Each demon delights not only in feeding, but in shaping the music of agony. The greater entities, the princes of despair, the avatars of ruin, listen to this endless symphony as one might savor fine art. They weave it into currents of power, each note strengthening their dominion, each refrain echoing back into the Imperium through nightmares, cults, and corruption. The song of the damned is not wasted. It is harvest in him both. For the souls themselves, this merging is annihilation in slow motion. Individual cries dissolve into collective resonance, and in that dissolution lies a deeper horror. The soldier who once screamed his name in defiance hears it, repeated back by 10,000 mouths, distorted until it is no longer his. The mother's sob becomes part of a chord carried by strangers she never knew, until her grief is no longer hers alone, but a shared lament stripped of intimacy. To lose memory is one wound. To lose even the uniqueness of suffering is another. They come to realize that they are not simply consumed by the warp. They are joined, their pain made communal, their selfhood melted into a chorus without end. The choir is not passive. It surges. At times the resonance builds into crescendos so powerful that even the Imperium shudders. Planets far from the eye of terror hear the echoes in their dreams, waking with cries they cannot explain. Astropaths sometimes mistake the song for signals, only to claw out their own eyes when they realize the transmission is nothing but despair carried on psychic current. Entire worlds tremble under waves of lament that roll through the Imperium like storms, disrupting travel, warping communication, shattering fragile minds. The cries of the damned are not confined to their prison. They bleed into reality, reminders that the warp is never truly sealed. Among the damned, there are those who try to resist becoming part of the choir. Some clamp their voices into silence, hoping to keep themselves apart. But silence does not shield them. It is drawn out of them regardless, their unvoiced pain extracted and woven into the music against their will. Others scream deliberately off-key, seeking to disrupt, to fracture the harmony. For their defiance they are seized by demonic hands, torn apart, and reassembled into voices more obedient. There is no refuge. Every sound, every silence, is harvested and remade until it finds its place in the arrangement. The choir cannot be escaped. It is as infinite as the warp itself. The most terrible realization comes when the damned hear the choir not only around them, but within them. The resonance does not remain external. It vibrates through their very essence, filling them with voices not their own. They find themselves echoing the cries of strangers, sobbing with grief they never lived, screaming with terror they never knew. Identity blurs further. The soul that was once singular becomes porous, filled with 1,000 voices, 1,000 memories not their own, until it is impossible to distinguish where one ends and another begins. In this way, the warp erases individuality, not with silence, but with excess. To be drowned in another's suffering is to forget one's own. And yet, from this sea of despair, the gods themselves are nourished. The song of the damned rises as worship, whether intended or not. Corn savors the rage embedded in the screams, the fury of souls that die in endless battle. Slanish drinks deep of the agony, refined into ecstasy. Every trembling note of pleasure-warped pain a feast. Nurgle listens for the weary acceptance, the sobs that sink into laughter as rot embraces them. Tinch savors the shifting cadences, the unpredictable harmonies born from betrayal and fear. Each cry, each lament, is fuel for something vast and monstrous. and the choir ensures that not a single note of suffering is wasted. The damned are not merely tormented, they are instruments, their agony refined into power for the Imperium's eternal masters. Some whisper that even the Emperor hears the choir, seated upon the golden throne, that in the ceaseless chorus of despair, faint voices of his faithful reach him still, twisted though they are. Pilgrims, on distant shrine worlds, pray that their litanies might drown out the lament, that the hymns of the ecclesiarchy might counter the warp's endless song. Yet the damned know the truth. No hymn silences the choir. No prayer ends the resonance. Their voices have become part of something vast, and vastness has no mercy. Thus, the warp reveals its cruelest truth. Torment is not solitary. No soul is left to suffer alone. They are joined, bound together in symphony, each voice a thread in a tapestry of despair that stretches beyond time. The choir has no finale, no closing refrain. It continues, swelling and shifting, conducted by claws unseen, and in its unending harmony, the self is lost forever. Among the endless shrieks and the symphony of despair, there are whispers, faint, fragile things, spoken between gulfs of torment, like sparks flickering in a storm. They are not commands of demons nor echoes of memories. They are rumors, carried from soul to soul, fragments of hope that refuse to die. Even here, in the abyss where eternity is nothing but suffering made eternal, the idea of release lingers. It is not shouted. It is not certain. It is whispered like contraband, passed quietly through the cracks of agony, and clutched with desperate hunger by those who hear it. Some tell of obliteration as mercy. They speak of souls so thoroughly devoured by the warp that nothing remains, not even a scream, to be consumed in totality, they say, is not torment, but escape. No fragments left to carve, no echoes left to harvest, no identity left to exploit. Oblivion becomes a prize, the end of music in a place where every cry is eternal resonance. The rumor spreads that demons sometimes gorge themselves too greedily, that in their excess they wipe a soul from existence, leaving behind no residue. To those who still endure, the thought of annihilation becomes a strange form of hope. Better to be nothing, they murmur, than to sing forever. Others cling to a different tale, that the Emperor's light pierces even here. They whisper of rare souls that flare with such faith that their cries cut through the endless choir, blazing like beacons in the immaterial dark. These sparks, they claim, are seen by him upon the golden throne, carried on the Astronomican's beam. For a heartbeat of eternity, his gaze falls upon them, and in that gaze they are lifted, pulled from torment into silence. Perhaps they are drawn back to the Imperium. Perhaps they are gathered into his essence, preserved in ways beyond mortal comprehension. None can agree, but the rumor endures. Because to believe it is to believe that no soul is ever beyond his reach. There are darker whispers still. Some claim that release comes not from the Emperor, nor from annihilation, but from bargains, that the warp itself, in its shifting cruelty, sometimes frees those who surrender fully, who give not merely memory, but will. Such souls vanish from the choir, their cries replaced with silence. Do they truly escape, or are they remade, their essence folded into daemonhood, their individuality obliterated in service to powers they once feared? To some, this possibility is terror. To others, it is still release, for what matters is not what they become, but that they no longer suffer as they did. The damned argue among themselves, though their voices are faint compared to the greater chorus. Some cling to these stories as absolution, whispering prayers that one day they will be chosen for release. Others denounce the rumors as tricks, illusions seeded by the warp itself to deepen despair when hope inevitably collapses. And still others sink into silence, unwilling to believe anything beyond the torment that already defines them. But the fact remains that the rumors persist, spreading again and again, stronger than denial, stronger than disbelief. in a place where every certainty has been shattered. Hope survives as a lie too stubborn to die, and yet, when the whispers come, so too comes the doubt. How can any rumor carry truth in a realm where memory is weapon and thought is corruption? How can the damned trust their own perceptions, when even their most sacred recollections are twisted into mockery? Perhaps every tale of release is nothing more than a new shape of torment, a bait to keep them struggling, to prolong their flavor. Perhaps oblivion itself is an illusion, another cruel jest played by the warp to deepen despair. The damned know this, but still they cling to the stories, for even a poisoned hope burns brighter than despair left unchallenged. Some claim to have seen the evidence. They swear that in rare moments, the choir of screams falters, a single voice falling silent, not from exhaustion, but from absence, a note cut from the symphony, not reshaped, not sustained, but ended. These witnesses hold the proof close to themselves, repeating it again and again until it becomes scripture. Others refute them, saying the warp allows such silences only to bait the rest, to torment them with the illusion that release is possible. The uncertainty gnaws deeper than any blade. To believe or not to believe becomes its own torment. And there are those who whisper of something else entirely, that beyond the Emperor, beyond demons, beyond oblivion, there are currents in the warp older than gods, that some souls, by chance or by will, slip between those currents and vanish into realms unknown. Where do they go? None can say. Perhaps into nothingness, perhaps into dreams, perhaps into truths the Imperium has never dared to speak. This rumor is the most fragile of all, dismissed by many as madness, yet it too survives, carried in the hush between screams. In the end, the damned do not know which story is truth. Perhaps none are, perhaps all are, in fragments and half-shapes, as is the nature of the But what matters is that even here, in the pit where eternity is nothing but hunger and song, the idea of release endures. The warp feeds on suffering, but it cannot erase the spark of yearning, the hunger for an end. That yearning becomes its own form of rebellion. To hope is to resist, even if the hope is false. And so the choir sings on, its voices swelling, its resonance without end, yet woven through its eternal lament are the whispers soft, persistent, whispers of obliteration, whispers of salvation, whispers of escape into realms unnamed. The warp devours all, but the rumors remain, and in that fragile persistence lies the final torment and the final mercy. For no soul ever truly knows if release is real, only that the question endures: does any soul ever escape the warp? Or do all voices, no matter how bright, eventually dissolve into the endless choir? The Imperium does not answer. It never does. It only listens, and it feeds, and it waits.